Today's top story from the perspective of someone who's there.
You are looking live.
This just in.
Not my beat.
Our very patient and just very knowledgeable, very excellent guest today is our good buddy Ben Standig. Ben, what's up? How are you, dude?
Craig, I'm good, man. How about yourself?
I'm good now that all the buttons are working. You know, I had to get the fancy introduction for you, and the program was stalling, and so was I. But we got it. Now we're here, and we can talk about all the very smart people the Commanders have hired. Because there's a lot of really smart people the Commanders have hired. Have you ever seen this many like Ivy League level brains in one football front office?
Oh wow! I can't. I don't know either direction. I'm sure there's people with a lot of good diplomas out there, but yeah, I mean, it's a very interesting group compared to the last one. I'm not even saying better or worse, but I'm just saying it's very different compared to the last one.
That is for sure. So let's get into some of the moves that were made over the weekend. Well, actually, before we get to their latest Ivy League guy in Ben Sasna, there's another front office addition, a new director of college scouting, I believe is the ultimate title that he got, that you and your colleague who covers the Ravens for The Athletic reported on first over the weekend. Introduce us to the newest scouting member of the Commanders front office and how that has changed even in the couple of weeks here since the draft.
Yeah, David Blackburn, he was the director of college scouting with the Ravens. He's going to be director of pro personnel on this side. You know, I always, even going back to the Adam Peters hire, when you're hiring the assistant, for the assistant GM or a coordinator or whatever, it's hard to sometimes know where that person's success or failures start and where it's connected to the person who is above them. So you never quite know for sure. But, look, if you're going to have that thought and pick from an organization to give them some extra boost, I mean, the Ravens would certainly be one of those that you would say, hey, that's a good place to pluck somebody from. So, yeah, he's a younger guy coming from that college scouting background to join here in the pro personnel side. Eric Stokes, last week, we found, I think it was last week, we found out that he wasn't going to be returning. He wasn't having his contract renewed. And then Chris Polian left to go to the Browns. So here comes somebody to sort of, helm that part of the front office now. So, like I said, from the Ravens perspective, that's obviously an organization based on how they do things. Is a good way to go. So just from that angle, the idea that Adam Peters, who was the assistant GM for the team that was the 1 seed last year in the NFC playoffs, is here hiring somebody from the front office of the AFC team that was the 1 seed last year. That just wasn't happening under the previous regimes. So it's a good example of how things, in terms of perception at a minimum, have changed here in Ashburn.
No doubt. And the organizations they're coming from, I feel like, are all built a certain way. Like San Francisco's built on physicality. Baltimore's built on physicality. Detroit, this modern version under Dan Campbell, is built on physicality. So it makes sense, the kind of through lines, the organizations that they're recruiting from. I do think it's interesting, Ben, and this is just kind of how it works in the NFL. This isn't by any stretch of criticism, but I'm curious your perspective on it. They did just go through the draft with all these guys that are now on the way out, both pro and free agency, by the way, pro and college scouts that are exiting the building. How were they able to make it work? And like, what kind of feedback did you get from folks in the building during the process on how it was? Now that we know some of them were doing their last work for the Commanders and ultimately would find their way out of the building, whether they were sent or got the writing on the wall.
Yeah. So post draft, it is unusual to an extent to say, hey, we no longer want your services here, but we just went through the most important part of our roster building opportunities. But it's the way things work. The process for scouting, certainly for college, but for pro as well. begins, well before free agency or the draft. And once you hit a certain point, you're like, hey, we don't really want this person out there being able to talk to whomever, about what we're doing here. That's going to happen eventually if they leave, but we don't want that happening to affect our plans in the moment. So they typically hold back these changes. It's interesting, right? They just had a draft that was considered to be pretty good. Obviously starting with Jaden Daniels, but going from there. And, we all know the deal is going to take 3 or 4 years or whatever it might be to have a feel for how these drafts did. So far, most of the changes have come on the pro side rather than the college side. And last year we know in free agency things didn't go too well. So I don't know if there's any correlation there. Some of it may just simply be Adam Peters wants to bring certain people in. They did bring in one person to be a pro scout that he worked with for a year at the 49ers. And so you don't quite know where is it I want to bring somebody in versus we need to make a change. But, that's something I've noticed, again, even with Stokes. I don't know that Polian was not going to be renewed if he didn't go to the Browns, but it was a change. So it seems like the changes are primarily appears on the pro side versus the college side, i.e. also like Tim Gribble, who has been here forever, going back to, Jay Gruden, and even I think even beyond that, just in terms of amount of time with the organization, he's been here. So it feels like there's some sense that maybe they wanted to make changes on that side. Either way, that is where most of the changes have been made, whether it's the pro personnel or on the scouting side.
Ben Standig with us here on the Hoffman Show. I think that's also, now that I'm thinking about the free agent class this year, it's interesting too because they brought in so many guys that they had familiarity with, like someone on the coaching staff, one of the new guys, or Peters himself had relationships or had previously coached or brought in so many of their free agents, even though they brought in what was wound up being like 25, 26 guys. And so clearly, I feel like they might have gone through the process and been like, hey, we're not really going to worry about what you guys think might fit this staff and this new style of play because y'all clearly ain't done this very well before. We're just going to kind of go with guys they like. And I also think that becomes interesting, Ben, too, when you think about the building in the future. They didn't sign a lot of guys to multiple year deals. And so I also wonder how much they trusted does this essentially, I guess, put a different spin on the way they treated free agency this year? If perhaps Peters got in the building and went, I don't know if I have the scouts to really invest, even though we have all this cap space that we could.
Sure. And look, all this has been done. I'm sure once they got past the draft, Adam Peters gave out the biggest exhale possible. I mean, he's had, once he got hired at the beginning of January, it's been nonstop with hiring a head coach and on from there. And free agency wasn't that far away from the moment that he came on board, and he has to get going quick. But you're right, in a certain way, the free agency was very similar to the ones that we all questioned to a degree with Ron Rivera in terms of a lot of bringing in people that you knew. The difference was that the previous regime was mostly people they knew from one team, as opposed to they knew from whatever it was, 49ers, right. Cowboys,
Cardinals,
right? Right, Chargers, So, they brought in people from a whole bunch of different spots, but you're right, there was typically some connection. Austin Eckler and Anthony Lynn had a connection. The defensive lineman, or pretty much anybody on defense with Dan Quinn. And, even Mike Davis at cornerback happened to be his secondary coach when the Chargers happened to be here, et cetera. So coincidental or not, all these things did take place. And, look, when you're going on a fly like that, you do probably have to tighten, your process a little bit because you're not relying completely on months of scouting. You're going, each person did their own, and we have to come up with a plan. And you're right. The 1 year deal, I think, made perfect sense for where this team is at, but maybe there was something else about, hey, let's not go too crazy here for certain players because we just don't know for sure, right, who they are. Frankie Lou, there was like some loose connections, but like, that might be the only one where like they signed somebody to a bigger deal that like it's not like an obvious tie, and yet he was one of the better free agents out there that people raved about, right? So, it does make sense in that regard that, again, whether it's trust or not, they didn't seem to rely too heavily on their pro side that was already in the building.
For sure. Just add it to the list of reasons why it made sense. Ben Standig with us. Of course, you can read his work in The Athletic. He's joining us here on the Hoffman Show. You can also catch him with Sheehan frequently during the week here on the Team 980. So, Ben, Sosna, do we have a pronunciation would be my first question, which is always fun when you get on a live radio show and realize you got multiple avenues you could go down, Ben. But he is, I think, 31, 32 years old, coming over. And he's a University of Penn graduate, so he's one of the Ivy League guys here. Going to be the lead contract negotiator and seemingly a lot more as the senior vice president of football operations. What do all those fancy titles mean job responsibility wise, and how significant of a hire is this, Ben? Because it seems like people around the league, this was an eyebrow raiser.
Yeah, so it's Brandon Sosner. You're talking to me, so the beast. I think it's Sosna, to be honest. I'm not 100% sure, but that's what I've been going with. Yeah, it's a pretty fascinating one. To go back, I said before how different this is. There's we don't know how good this group will ultimately be together for 100 reasons. But, okay, it's interesting on paper. And one reason it is, I remember early on in the Ron Rivera era, especially once they brought in Marty Herney and Martin Mayhew as well, I remember I think I was doing one of my agent surveys and asking what they thought of the group. And one person, or a couple of people, brought up a point of age, not in terms of like age discrimination, but ultimately you are, about your experiences, right? And these are guys who are older, all three older guys, and they're not going to necessarily bring the cutting edge vibe that you need to, that you see with a lot of other teams. And this is the opposite of that. Here we go, a 31-year-old. He'd been with Detroit for a couple of years, but in a pretty big job in terms of being the contract guy, having a lot of salary cap responsibility. And, Brad Holmes, the Lions GM, obviously has done a really good job in Detroit the last few years, turning that around. He gave credit, a lot of credit to Sasna for helping out with their moves when it comes to the cap and things like that. So it's not just somebody to do this job. It's somebody who's viewed as an up-and-comer. And again, experience matters. Of course it does. So he's lacking that relative to others, but it's a younger guy, similar to David, Blackburn being a younger guy, and even Adam Peters, right? So I think that to me is interesting. It feels like not only have they turned things over, and no disrespect to the last group, but it feels like they've maybe kind of entered modern football thinking versus, not saying wrong thinking, but more of the old school type of thinking. So, we'll see. I think the other interesting component here, of course, is if you look at his job responsibilities as they laid it out, very similar to what Rob Rogers had done for this group under Rivera, and then also this year under Peters. Does that mean that he is out? And, it feels like that. I don't know. They haven't said yet, so I don't want to presume that maybe they're just adding more pieces to the puzzle. But at the same point, you have to wonder about Rob Rogers' future now with Sasna here.
Yes. And yes, as you said, Brandon Sosna, my bad. Too many BS initials here, Ben.
Exactly.
My little
BS.
Brain can't handle it.
BS.
And by the way, Rogers, also a guy who's a Ivy League grad. So if the 1993 graduate of Harvard exits and Sosna is his replacement, then there's still that many Ivy League brains in the building. And I just I joke about that, and I think it's kind of like fun to be like, wow, look at all these smart dudes that they're hiring. But I also think, Ben, this is very, very reflective of Josh Harris. Is this kind of what you expected? Like if we rewind a year ago, I can't believe this was only a year ago, but we spent so much of May and June worrying about the sale and the finalization of all of that, and we knew Josh Harris was incoming. And if I told you that this is kind of what it looks like a year later, I think my reaction would be like, yep, that sounds about right. What would be yours?
Yeah, no, for sure. I mean, I think also, like, if you look at it broadly, like, ultimately, some of the pieces that we're talking about are in roles that we expect. Like somebody's going to be the director of player personnel, somebody's going to be in charge of contracts and cap space. But it's also like hiring Bob Myers, an NBA GM, obviously a very successful one, to be an advisor to Harris. Hiring Dave Gardy away from the NFL office, somebody who has been like a go-to for all the teams in the league when it came to operations over the last, decade plus, who's here going to be sort of in a very different role. It's still a little bit vague to a degree, but he's going to help out in game in certain capacities and also sort of be the main go-to for, trends in officiating and some other deals. These are outside the box ideas that is kind of what I was expecting from Josh Harris. I mean, say what you want about the process, but Josh Harris is the one that greenlit that said, okay, I am willing as an owner to take a step back in wins in order to build this thing up. And, we don't have to get into the whole, did the process work? I think it did. Others will say no because they never won a title. But the point is he's willing to think in ways that are beyond just conventional hire this, hire that. And I think then combined with these individuals on these other roles, I think it does show Josh Harris's input. Also, like, Eugene Shen, right? That was the first hire they made, right, even way before Adam Peters, to build up an analytics department that was basically completely understaffed previously. So, I think it all has a lot of Josh Harris's fingerprints on it. Whether the individual hires are because of him, who knows? But the position, some of them themselves, I think does show that this is more of a, I don't want to say cutting edge because that's maybe a bit much, but again, a more modern approach to how to find these edges that every team's looking for.
Right. It feels incredibly cutting edge because we've covered an organization, stuck in the ways of the dinosaurs. But I actually, Ben, when I ask you this to wrap up, because I actually get this question quite a bit. What is Shen's role now? Because he was, as you said, he's the first guy in. So I'd imagine he at first had, I don't want to say expansive power, but expansive influence, because if he said something, people were like, oh, that's the guy the boss hired. We got to listen to that. And now there's a bunch of people that the boss hired, and perhaps Shen is more neatly fit into a role that he was designed to be in from go, that was maybe outstretched at first, but that's just me prognosticating. You cover the team day in, day out. Where does Eugene Shen fit in now that the rest of the front office, or a lot of the rest of the front office, has been filled in?
Yeah, I mean, I think, this is, it's the analytics football strategy department, but on some level it should be probably called the looking for edges department, right? I mean, that's kind of what the whole point of analytics is about. You're trying to look at the game in different ways beyond just viewing tape and the more traditional football ways. What are opportunities that exist? What is it a certain player does that maybe just does not show up on tape in a certain way? What are some of the types of when to run certain plays, trends, what have you? So I think he's just part of that, to flesh out a different angle for how this team can find ways to be successful. And I think that's what's sort of interesting. And I need to sort of do this myself, is to take a step back and really kind of just look at what they've actually now put together. There may be other moves, but it feels like this is they've hit the main ones at this point. So yeah, I mean, Adam Peters is, everybody kind of reports to him. I'm assuming that's applicable to Eugene Shen, even though he was hired first. And then it's up to to Peters to figure out how to take all this information and then relay it to Dan Quinn and to others and find these opportunities to do this. By the way, nobody will have said this to me, but the day Eugene Shen's hire was announced was the day I knew that either Chase Young and or Montez Sweat was going to get traded, and then they were a few days later, because the decision to keep or sign those guys had a lot to do with how do you process what's the best way to build a roster. Sign these guys to a lot of money, or keep the money knowing the team is kind of struggling and invest it later in different ways, perhaps. So it's also situations like that. What's the best way to build a roster, et cetera. So yeah, it's a very interesting group to have to now figure out how how they each, kind of do their job and how it all fits together.
It would be so fascinating if they would let someone like you do a story on like who is coming up with the formulas, who's implementing them. Like, because there's some people that imagine like Shen are kind of high level thinkers, and it's like, can we come up with a new revelation? And then there's people who take that revelation and they actually have to implement it. And I'd imagine that's where like the Sosnas and some of these other guys come in. Gardy's somewhere between all that. Shen is probably doing some of both at this point in his career. But it would be so fascinating. And I have a feeling that they will never, ever let that information out, because that is the stuff that teams more than anything else value, because it truly is. Like, if you can find an edge that way, I love your terminology for that, Ben, the find an edge department. If you find it, you don't want people to even know that you have it, because then they'll go looking to try to find the same thing.
Yeah, and I mentioned the process earlier, what the 76ers did. I don't really think what they did, I mean, they did it to the extreme, but what they did wasn't any real different than, honestly, what the Wizards are doing right now, or what a lot of teams do, playing for the long game, not worrying about making incremental gains now. But what they did was they promoted it. They put it out there. They branded it, and they made it a thing. Whereas most teams, it's just like, no, we're doing what we're doing. We're not going to share it with the world. We're not going to discuss it. We're not going to give interviews to ESPN about what our exact ideas are. And that's what I think the main difference there was versus what most teams do. And you're right. I would love to know more, but this is where they have the opportunity to beat their competition. They hope. And yeah, they don't necessarily want all their thoughts out there for all of us to be aware of, and more importantly, for their competition to be aware of.
Yeah, come on, Commanders, give Ben a little bit. Give just a little bit. If you need backup, I'm there to fight for you, Ben. And I'll see you tomorrow out in Ashburn.
Sounds good. I'll take all the help I can get. Thanks, man.
Yeah, you got it. That's Ben Standig with us on the Hoffman Show.
This is the Hoffman Show on the Team 980 and the Odyssey app.